On the 7th of August 1944, a German panzer commander sitting inside the turret of a Mark IV Special heard a sound he had never heard before. It was not the rumble of artillery. It was not the crack of anti-tank fire. It was a howl, a deep mechanical scream coming from somewhere above the low cloud, moving fast, getting louder. Before he could identify the source, the hedgerow 60 meters to his left erupted in a wall of fire and shrapnel. 8 rockets, each carrying a 60-pound warhead with the destructive force of a 6-inch naval shell, had slammed into the road at nearly the speed of sound. The aircraft that fired them banked hard and climbed away, thick-winged, heavy, brutish. Nothing like the graceful Spitfires the Germans had learned to respect. This was something else entirely, and it was coming back around. That day would later be called the Day of the Typhoon. The Royal Air Force flew 305 Typhoon sorties over the fields around Mortain in a single afternoon, and by the time darkness fell, the most ambitious German counterattack since the Normandy landings had been shattered. But here is what makes this story extraordinary. Just 2 years before that afternoon, the aircraft that broke Hitler's last gamble in France had been weeks away from being cancelled. The Royal Air Force did not want it. The pilots did not trust it. The engine was seizing in flight, the tail was literally falling off in midair, and the man who designed it was watching his reputation collapse along with it. To understand how the Typhoon went from death sentence to war winner, you have to understand the crisis that created it. By 1940, Britain's fighter force was built around 2 aircraft, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Both had proven themselves in the Battle of Britain, but both had been designed in the mid-1930s, and by the turn of the decade they were approaching the limits of what their airframes and engines could deliver. The Spitfire could manage roughly 360 miles per hour. The Hurricane was slower still, and British intelligence knew that Germany was developing faster, heavier fighters with engines producing power that the current generation of British aircraft could not match. When the Focke-Wulf 190 finally appeared over France in 1941, those fears proved correct. It was faster than the Spitfire Mark V at most altitudes, more heavily armed, and could roll faster. For the first time since the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force was being outperformed in the air. The specification the Air Ministry issued in January of 1938 called for an interceptor capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour, a speed no British fighter had ever reached. To achieve it, the engine would need to produce at least 2,000 horsepower, nearly double what the Rolls-Royce Merlin was delivering. 2 competing designs were proposed. One was the Hawker Tornado, powered by a Rolls-Royce Vulture engine. The other was the Hawker Typhoon, powered by something far more ambitious, a brand new engine from D. Napier and Son called the Sabre. And this is where the engineering story becomes genuinely interesting, because the Sabre was not merely a bigger version of something that already existed. It was a fundamentally different kind of engine, and the gamble that Britain took on it would nearly destroy the Typhoon before the Typhoon ever saw combat. The man behind both aircraft designs was Sidney Camm. He was born in 1893 in Windsor, the eldest of 12 children in a carpenter's household. His father was a journeyman carpenter and joiner. Camm left school at 15 and took up the same trade, an apprentice woodworker, but Camm had an obsession that no carpentry shop could contain. As a boy, he and his brothers built model aircraft in their bedroom, then smuggled them through the streets of Windsor to sell directly to students at Eton College, delivering in secret to avoid the attention of local shopkeepers who would have reported them for undercutting prices. By 1912, the models had grown into something altogether more ambitious. Camm and his friends at the Windsor Model Aeroplane Club built a man-carrying glider. He was 19 years old. He had never set foot inside a university. He had no formal engineering degree, no scientific training, no credentials of any kind beyond a woodworking apprenticeship, and an extraordinary eye for what made an aircraft right. He did not think about engineering the way universities taught it. He thought about it the way a craftsman thinks about wood, from the inside out. Shortly before the First World War, Camm talked his way into a position at the Martinsyde Aeroplane Company at Brooklands as a shop floor carpenter. Within months, he had migrated to the drawing office. By 1925, at 32, he was the chief designer at Hawker Aircraft. By 1935, he had designed the Hurricane, the fighter that shot down more German aircraft during the Battle of Britain than the Spitfire and all other defences combined. At one point in the 30s, 84% of all aircraft in the Royal Air Force were of Camm design. So when the Air Ministry needed the next generation of British fighter, Camm was the obvious man, and the engine he chose for the Typhoon was unlike anything the Royal Air Force had ever flown behind. The Napier Sabre was an H-24 cylinder engine, not a V-12 like the Merlin that powered the Spitfire, not an air-cooled radial like the engines on American naval fighters, an H configuration. Picture 4 rows of 6 cylinders arranged in 2 flat horizontal layers, one on top of the other, driving two separate crankshafts that were geared together at the front of the engine. 24 cylinders, liquid-cooled, 2,180 horsepower from 37 litres of displacement. To put that number in perspective, the Rolls-Royce Merlin in a 1940 Spitfire was producing just over 1,000 horsepower. The Sabre was delivering more than double that power from an engine that was only modestly larger in physical size. And the reason it could achieve this extraordinary output came down to one radical engineering decision: the use of sleeve valves instead of conventional poppet valves. In a standard piston engine, the flow of air and fuel into each cylinder and the expulsion of exhaust gases out is controlled by poppet valves, small metal, mushroom-shaped components that open and close rapidly at the top of each cylinder, driven by a camshaft. They work well at moderate engine speeds, but at very high speeds, the kind of speeds needed to produce 2,000 horsepower, poppet valves reach a physical limit. They begin to bounce. The spring that closes the valve cannot keep up with the speed of the camshaft opening it. The valve floats. It does not seal properly. The engine loses efficiency, loses compression, loses power. In the late 1930s, the great engine researcher Harry Ricardo published a study concluding that poppet valve engines were unlikely to ever exceed 1,500 horsepower reliably. To break through that ceiling, you needed something different. The sleeve valve was that something different. Instead of a small mushroom-shaped valve at the top of the cylinder, a thin machined steel sleeve sits inside the cylinder, between the piston and the cylinder wall. This sleeve slides up and down, and as it moves, precision-machined ports in the sleeve align with ports in the cylinder wall, opening to let air and fuel in and exhaust gases out, then closing again as the sleeve slides past. Think of it like this. A poppet valve engine is a swinging door. At walking speed, the door opens and closes perfectly. But if you try to open and close that door 3,000 times every minute, the hinges shatter. A sleeve valve is a sliding window. It can move back and forth at extraordinary speed because there is nothing to bounce, nothing to slam, no springs to fatigue. The sleeve just glides. In theory, it was the future of high-performance aircraft engines. In practice, building it nearly broke Napier and nearly killed the Typhoon. But the sleeve valve was only one part of the Sabre's ambition. The engine also featured a 2-speed supercharger that force-fed compressed air into the cylinders. More air meant more fuel could be burned, which meant more power. And all of this machinery, 24 cylinders, 2 crankshafts, the supercharger, the accessory drives, was packaged into an engine that was remarkably compact for its output. But compact meant crowded, and crowded meant that the massive chin-mounted radiator, that distinctive scoop underneath the Typhoon's nose that gave the aircraft its blunt, aggressive look, had to handle an enormous cooling load. The Sabre ran brutally hot. If the cooling system failed, the engine destroyed itself in minutes. The chin radiator was the aircraft's lifeline, and it was also its vulnerability. A single bullet through that radiator and the Typhoon was coming down. The problem was manufacturing precision. Those steel sleeves had to be machined to tolerances so tight that most factories in Britain could not achieve them. The sleeves had to be perfectly circular. Any distortion, any microscopic deviation from perfect roundness, and the sleeve would bind against the piston or the cylinder wall. The engine would seize, instantly, catastrophically, in flight. And in the early production Sabres, this is exactly what happened with terrifying regularity. After running for just a few hours, sometimes not even surviving initial bench tests, engines began suffering catastrophic sleeve failures. Sleeves cracked. Sleeves warped from heat, sleeves seized against pistons, locking the engine solid. Early production Sabres were limited to 25 hours of operation before being completely torn apart for overhaul. 25 hours. A Rolls-Royce Merlin could run for hundreds before needing major work, and the supply crisis was devastating. Engine production fell so far behind airframe production that completed Typhoon fuselages sat engineless in factories, useless. Napier resorted to an extraordinary measure. They would install a single working Sabre into a finished airframe, fly that aircraft to a dispersal field, remove the engine, truck it back to the factory, and install it in the next airframe to ferry that one out. The same engine shuttled from aircraft to aircraft like a rental car, because there were simply not enough working examples to go around. Consider the absurdity of that. Britain was building fighters it could not power, but the engine was only one of the Typhoon's problems. The airframe itself was trying to kill its pilots in 2 separate ways. First, carbon monoxide. The Sabre's exhaust system leaked poisonous fumes through gaps in the engine bay firewall. The metal barrier between the engine compartment and the cockpit. Carbon monoxide is colourless and odourless at low concentrations. Pilots were losing consciousness in flight without understanding why. Without warning, a man would slump forward in his harness, the aircraft would dive, and that was the end. The interim solution was blunt but necessary. Every Typhoon pilot was ordered to wear his oxygen mask at all times during flight, not because of altitude, but because the air inside his own cockpit was slowly poisoning him. Second, and far more terrifying, the tail. At high speeds, particularly during dives, the Typhoon's elevator began to flutter. This vibration created stress fractures at the transport joint where the rear fuselage met the tail section. On multiple occasions, the entire empennage, the complete tail assembly, horizontal stabilizer, elevators, vertical fin, rudder, simply separated from the aircraft in flight. No warning, no progressive failure. One moment, a complete fighter aircraft. The next moment, the tail was tumbling through the sky behind a pilotless fuselage. These were not combat losses. These were structural disintegrations during routine flights in clear weather. Pilots who had survived combat with the Luftwaffe were dying because their own aircraft was tearing itself apart. By early 1942, Fighter Command was openly discussing cancellation. The Typhoon appeared to be finished. And this is where a pilot changed the story. His name was Roland Beaumont. He was not an engineer. He was a fighter pilot, a decorated squadron leader who had flown Hurricanes over France and during the Battle of Britain. Beaumont was assigned to one of the first operational Typhoon squadrons, and he immediately grasped two things that the desk-bound officials at Fighter Command could not see. First, the Typhoon had serious, potentially fatal problems that needed urgent fixing. Second, underneath those problems was a machine of extraordinary raw capability. At low altitude, the Typhoon was the fastest thing in the sky. Nothing in the Royal Air Force could touch it below 10,000 feet. And when the Luftwaffe introduced the Focke-Wulf 190 in late 1942 and began launching devastating hit-and-run raids on the English south coast, streaking in at low level, bombing, and racing back across the Channel before defenders could react, no British fighter could catch them. The Spitfire Mark V was too slow at sea level. The aging Hurricane had no chance. But the Typhoon, with its monstrous Sabre engine and 4 20mm cannon, could chase down a Focke-Wulf 190 at treetop height and destroy it. Beaumont championed the aircraft relentlessly, working directly with Hawker engineers to identify every fault, while simultaneously proving its combat effectiveness against the German raiders. The tail joint was reinforced with external fishplate straps, heavy metal brackets bolted around the transport joint like a splint on a broken limb. It was not elegant. It was a field expedient, a bodge, a temporary fix that became permanent, but it held. The carbon monoxide problem was addressed with improved seals and redesigned exhaust stubs, and the engine, the most critical failure point of all, was finally tamed through a collaboration that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Napier was forced to work with Bristol, their direct competitor in the aero-engine market. Bristol had been manufacturing sleeve valve radial engines since 1932 and had solved the very manufacturing problems that were destroying the Sabre. Bristol's Taurus engine happened to share the same 5-inch bore diameter as the Sabre. Bristol's sleeve-making expertise, combined with a process of nitriding and lapping that hardened and smoothed the sleeve surfaces, finally brought Sabre reliability to acceptable levels. By late 1943, the engine was still demanding, still maintenance-intensive, but it was no longer a death sentence. And here is the part that nobody in 1941 saw coming. The very features that made the Typhoon a failure as a high-altitude interceptor made it devastating as a low-level ground attack aircraft, a role nobody had originally designed it for. The thick wing, 19.5% thickness-to-chord ratio at the root, limited its performance above 20,000 feet, where thinner winged aircraft like the Spitfire danced. But at low altitude, that thick wing provided extraordinary stability. Where a thin-winged fighter bounced and jolted in the dense, turbulent air near the ground, the Typhoon sliced through it like a locomotive on rails. Stable, steady, a platform you could aim from. The heavy Sabre engine that was too bulky for agile high-altitude dogfighting delivered a top speed of 412 miles per hour at sea level, faster than anything on the ground could outrun, and faster than anything in the sky at that altitude could catch. And those heavy, strong wings could carry weapons loads that would have ripped the wings off a Spitfire. 2 1,000-pound bombs, earning the aircraft the nickname Bombfoon, and then, from late 1943, the weapon that would define the Typhoon forever, 8 RP-3 rockets on rails under the wings, 4 on each side, each carrying a 60-pound semi-armor-piercing warhead. A single Typhoon diving at 400 miles per hour carried the equivalent broadside firepower of a destroyer, and it could deliver that firepower directly onto a target barely larger than a cricket pitch. By the spring of 1944, 26 squadrons of Typhoons were operational with the 2nd Tactical Air Force, but the Typhoon had been proving itself long before D-Day. Throughout 1943, Typhoon squadrons launched relentless attacks on the German transport network in occupied France. Day and night raids on trains, bridges and rail junctions. 380 Typhoons were lost that year, mostly to anti-aircraft fire, but Typhoon pilots also shot down 103 German aircraft in air-to-air combat, including 52 Focke-Wulf 190s. The first operational rocket attack was carried out by 181 Squadron against the Camm power station in October of 43. By Normandy, the technique was perfected. Before D-Day itself, Typhoons drew a critical assignment, blinding the German coastal defences. Typhoons of numbers, 98 and 609 squadrons, destroyed German radar stations along the Channel coast, demolishing all 6 long-range stations south of Boulogne. 15 more were left inoperable. By the time the invasion fleet crossed the Channel, much of the French coast was electronically blind, and the system the 2nd Tactical Air Force developed for directing Typhoons in the ground battle was revolutionary, the cab rank. Typhoons orbited at 10,000 feet above the front line. On the ground, Royal Air Force forward air controllers riding in armoured vehicles with VHF radio travelled with the leading units. When they identified a target, they called in the Typhoons and marked the position with smoke shells. The aircraft peeled off, dived, and struck. Within minutes of a controller spotting a threat, rockets were arriving on it. No other air force had anything this responsive. Picture yourself in a Typhoon cockpit over Normandy in the summer of 44. You are orbiting at 10,000 feet in a formation of 4, the cab rank they call it, circling like hawks waiting for prey. Below you, the Norman hedgerows stretch in every direction, patchwork fields and sunken lanes. Your radio crackles. A forward air controller on the ground, riding in an armoured car with the lead infantry company, has spotted a German panzer column moving through a village 2 miles ahead of the front line. He gives you the grid reference and marks the target with smoke shells. You peel off, push the nose down. The speed builds, 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. The controls get heavy. It takes real physical strength on the stick and rudder pedals to keep the aircraft aligned. German anti-aircraft gunners are pumping tracer up at you, red and yellow arcs that seem to float slowly, then rush past like meteors. At 2,200 yards, just over a mile, you press the firing button. 8 rockets leave the rails in sequence with a sound like tearing fabric, amplified 1,000-fold. The aircraft lurches from the recoil. You pull up hard, the G-forces pressing you into the seat, and as you climb away you glance back to see the road below erupting in fire. That was one pass, one aircraft. In a full cab rank sortie, a dozen Typhoons would make that run, one after another, until nothing on that road was moving. The Typhoon's supreme moment came at Mortain. On the 7th of August 1944, Hitler ordered Operation Lüttich. 4 panzer divisions, including the 1st SS Leibstandarte and the 2nd SS Das Reich, driving west to cut off Patton's 3rd Army at Avranches. It was the most ambitious German counterattack since the Normandy landings, roughly 300 tanks aimed at punching through American lines and reaching the coast. The attack began under cover of darkness and morning fog, overrunning elements of the American 30th Infantry Division. By noon, German tanks had captured Mortain itself and were rolling west. The situation was genuinely desperate. Then the fog lifted. Typhoons from 121 wings spotted a German armoured column nearly 5 miles long heading toward the coast. They radioed back, and within the hour the sky above Mortain was filled with diving Typhoons. 305 sorties in a single afternoon. That day would be remembered as the Day of the Typhoon. They claimed 90 tanks destroyed and 59 damaged. Post-war analysis revised those numbers. The rockets hit roughly 4% of the time against a tank-sized target, and most destroyed German armour was actually knocked out by American ground fire. But the Typhoons broke the attack in ways no statistics could capture. They scattered armoured columns into hedgerows. They destroyed the fuel trucks and ammunition vehicles that the panzers needed to keep advancing. They shattered German operational cohesion completely. Inexperienced tank crews, terrified by the howling approach of a diving Typhoon, abandoned their vehicles intact and ran. Eisenhower himself was unequivocal. The Supreme Allied Commander credited the rocket-firing Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force with smashing the enemy spearhead. He said the result of the strafing was that the enemy attack was effectively brought to a halt, and a threat was turned into a great victory. Those were not the words of a diplomat being polite. Those were the words of a 5-star general who understood that without the Typhoons, Operation Lüttich might have succeeded, and if it had, Patton's 3rd Army would have been cut off in Brittany, and the entire timeline of the liberation of France would have been rewritten. 2 weeks after Mortain, as the German 7th Army attempted to retreat through the Falaise Gap, typhoons caught them in the open. The roads through the pocket became a graveyard of burned-out vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment stretching for miles. Columns of smoke rose so high they were visible from the English coast. Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson, one of the most decorated Allied pilots of the war, called Falaise one of the greatest killing grounds of the war. The cost was savage. 151 Typhoon pilots died in the Normandy campaign, 22% of all who flew, killed in less than 3 months. They flew at treetop height into concentrated flak, diving straight at targets that were shooting back at them. Every sortie was an act of extraordinary courage in an aircraft that had tried to kill its own pilots before the enemy ever had a chance. Now consider the Typhoon against its competitors. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was superb, heavily armed, extraordinarily durable, but it was designed as a high-altitude escort fighter and adapted for ground attack second. Its turbo-supercharged radial engine gave it tremendous high-altitude performance, but made it physically enormous at low level. The Soviet EL-2 Sturmovik was purpose-built for close support and armoured like a flying tank, but it was nearly 100 miles per hour slower than the Typhoon near the ground, and Luftwaffe fighters ate them alive. The German Stuka had been devastating early in the war, but by 44 it was obsolete. Too slow, too vulnerable. None of them combined speed, firepower, and survivability the way the Typhoon did. The Typhoon was retired in October of 1945. Over 3,300 had been built, most by the Gloucester Aircraft Company. Most airframes were scrapped within months, worn out, their Sabre engines too demanding for peacetime. Today, only one substantially complete Typhoon survives, at the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon. A replica stands at the Memorial de la Paix in Camm, steps from the beaches where it earned its legend. But the Typhoon's true legacy is in what it taught. Sidney Camm took every painful lesson and poured them into the Hawker Tempest. The Typhoon done right, thinner wing, improved Sabre, bubble canopy. The Tempest became the principal Allied weapon against the V-1 flying bomb, shooting down 638 between June and September of 1944. Later, Tempest destroyed 20 Messerschmitt 262 jet fighters, one of the few piston-engined aircraft fast enough to catch a jet. After the war, Camm's evolutionary chain continued. The Sea Fury became the fastest piston-engined fighter the Royal Navy ever operated, and in Korea, a Sea Fury pilot shot down a MiG-15 jet, one of the rarest kills in aviation history. Camm himself moved into the jet age. He designed the Hawker Hunter, the swept-wing fighter that captured the world speed record in 1953. His final achievement was the groundwork for the Harrier, the world's first practical vertical takeoff combat jet. He was knighted in 1953. He never earned a university degree. He died on the 12th of March 1966 at 72 while playing golf at the Richmond Golf Club. 52 aircraft types, 26,000 machines built. Tom Sopwith called him the greatest designer of fighter aircraft the world had ever known. But the Typhoon was the one that almost broke him, the one that was killing its own pilots before it ever met the enemy, and the one that, when the fog cleared over Mortain on an August afternoon, stopped 4 Panzer divisions and changed the course of the war. They nearly cancelled it in 42. By 44, Eisenhower was calling it the weapon that turned a threat into a victory. That is the Hawker Typhoon, the fighter that was never supposed to fight on the ground, and changed the war from there.